We're going today be talking about investigator-led clinical trials in Ireland, and in particularly how we can support those studies, those very important studies. I'm going to set up a little bit of the context for why we've organized this event, and then we'll go to speakers after that. Probably preaching to the converted for this audience. I know most of you, I see a lot of friendly faces, I don't see any angry faces, and I know that most of you are very invested in clinical trials. And just for the sake of posterity, I will say the things that we need to say about clinical trials. One is they are critical for medical advances. And I mean advances, I mean things that are actually going to make it into changes in how we practice medicine. Having trials is a key step in that. And importantly, when we are trying to advance medicine, we have to do that in a way that satisfies a number of decision makers and stakeholders. So the ability for clinical trials to provide a trustworthy basis for evaluating the efficacy of new treatments is obviously very critical. That, of course, has knock-on effects for the efficiency and effectiveness of overall health systems. Hopefully, we are doing studies in general clinical research, including trials, that are going to have some kind of impact on the way we do things at a systems level. We have additional impacts on economies, and I don't just mean money spent. I also mean that we are making things hopefully more efficient, more effective. We are actually gaining new knowledge and putting that knowledge to use. That is what trials do. So it really improves economic output in a very real way beyond other important things like investments, jobs, and the rest of it. And then I know from my many clinical colleagues how they also view trials as an important means for getting access to medicines for their patients. Right? So very much on an individual level, these trials and being able to bring them to Ireland really, really matters, right, for the individual patient in addition to the overall system. So I shouldn't have to convince anybody that the trials matter. Now we come to the context of Ireland in clinical trials. Very recently, this map is now available at euclinicaltrials.eu, and you can look at all the trials now that are registered through CETIS, and we can do comparisons and look across the EU and look at how Ireland performs. And generally speaking, many of the people in this room will understand or already know that by most indicators, Ireland really underperforms in terms of the number of clinical trials that we host as sites here. And the typical comparison that comes up all the time, as a statistician, we want to always kind of adjust or normalize for things. Everything is relative. And so you often find ourselves in Ireland comparing ourselves to Denmark and Finland and thinking about overall trial activity. So despite having a very similar population size to these two countries, despite having, in terms of at least GDP, a larger economy, so to speak, we well underperform in terms of the number of trials. And you can look at all the different places the trials are registered, and you'll see the same story over and over and over again. Now, I'm not obviously the only person who knows this and recognizes it, and Ireland now is, I think, really doing a great job of turning to address this deficiency. So right now there is what's called the National Clinical Trials Oversight Group, and that's a ministerially appointed group. Many of you will know people who are on that. There might be a few of you who are actually on that panel today. And they are trying to, as I guess a first step, get to the bottom of how do we get more trials in Ireland. And not surprisingly, their focus from the outset is really about contracts. Right? We have to get things studied and approved and all the rest of it and get the machinery moving. And so that's what they are focused on. But the ultimate goal, again, is to make sure that we are doing more trials. We have more, need. Let's get over the hurdles to do exactly that. You can, if you're interested and you didn't aware of this, for some of you, you can go, I like to read the minutes of these meetings actually. I think they're really informative, so this is not something you knew anything about, that this group existed. You can certainly go and look into some of the stuff they're doing, and I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in the minutes of those meetings. And I also just want to briefly acknowledge, as Ireland is ramping up its capacity to support clinical trials, One is the work of the National Research Ethics Committee for Clinical Trials. So this has been in now, I think, for 4 years. I've been privileged to be a member since the beginning, and essentially having a single place to take regulated clinical trials. Obviously, we have the HPRA in place as well, who is considering clinical trials, and we'll hear more about that. And then, of course, we have the HRB, and thank you, HRB, for funding RCRF, who we stole the money from to pay for this event. And the HRB funding very proactively the clinical trial infrastructure that we do have in Ireland. Okay, so how do we support? If we are going to start from a position of saying that trials are very important, we don't have enough of them in Ireland, we're going to get some more trials, it's time to think then about how we can best place ourselves to support an increase in trials. I would say that, and people could argue with me if you feel like it later. I think if we doubled the number of trials that we were doing in Ireland, we'd still be kind of maybe middle of the pack. Right? So I think that would be a kind of minimal aspiration, to double what it is that we do, but that's a huge ask. And so the question becomes, what do we do? How can we prepare to support these trials? And in particular today, we're going to be talking about how can we support them with respect to study design, data management, and statistics and data analysis. So the things that I do for the CRF. And so to break this down just a little bit, I want to think through kind of the big picture of patient-focused research. And we have clinical trials as a part of that, which we can, for this discussion, we can divide up into those that are regulated and those that aren't regulated. So regulated studies, we'd be talking about investigational trials for medicinal products, medical devices, in vitro diagnostics. And then among regulated studies, we have this distinction between commercially sponsored and university sponsored. Now, the point of today is really talking about supports for investigator-led trials. And so these trials are really vital for health systems, for societies, for our clinician investigators, for our patients, in that these are trials that don't have an immediate and obvious commercial value, but that doesn't mean that what we learn from those trials isn't phenomenally important. So clear examples of this would be heads-up comparisons of two medicines that are already on the market. Right? Who does that kind of trial? What about de-escalation of treatment? Who does that kind of trial? Where's the commercial incentive to de-escalate treatments? Right? There's this whole raft of ideas. Health service trials, right? Surgical trials, things about how medicine is done in practice. Those are not things that typically have a strong commercial incentive. And so we have to have supports for these investigator-led trials in particular. Now, when we're talking about regulated trials, regulations are very clear that when you're doing a trial, the expectation is that you will have an expert trial statistician doing their expert job to support the goals of the trial. Right? This is non-negotiable, and if you are doing a regulated trial of a medicine and you expect that medicine to be approved by a regulator and then taken up by a health technology assessment and paid for one day, they're going to look for this, along with a lot of other things. So this isn't debatable. Now, if you are a commercial sponsor of trials, your ability to at least provide that expert support is kind of built in some ways, right? And I don't want to make it sound like that's a simple thing, and we can certainly talk about that a little bit more. But again, the focus here is on investigator-led trials, which by definition do not have massive amounts of money flowing into them to support them. So that's really the context that we're talking about here today. Now, in the UK, it would be our example, and we've got some wonderful speakers coming from the CTU network in the UK, a very developed trial research infrastructure to support investigator-led trials. And, we can look across that landscape of that network, somewhere between 350 and 400 FTE statisticians, right, working across the entire network. I've picked out a few specific CTUs here. So Aberdeen is a nice one to compare to Cork, kind of a similar population, the edge of Europe, so to speak. 8 FTE statisticians in Aberdeen, and Graham is here and can correct me if I've got that wrong, although I think he gave me that number, so he'd be correcting himself. Just to give a sense of the scale. Now, the population size isn't the main thing here, right? What is really different between the UK and here with respect to investigator-led trials, or at least one of them, is the National Institute of Health Research, right? They have a fairly large funding mechanism to funnel money into investigator-led studies that then can feed into the clinical trials units and support their activities. And so the scale there is very, very different. But if we were to talk about, a kind of what the similar story is in Ireland, and really what I mean here is statisticians who are kind of core funded in some respects, but who are existing to support studies that universities sponsor. So not academic statisticians, not just, there's a wide variety of types of statisticians, but people who are particularly employed in our research, clinical trial research infrastructure in Ireland to support university-sponsored trials. We can get a sense of it here. Now, this is an outdated report now. This was published in 2019, the HRB's review of their clinical trial infrastructure that they fund. And I remember when this report came out, I had been in my job at that point for about 4 years, so I could find myself. I'm the green dot under CRF Cork, Ireland. It wasn't entirely accurate there. I had Brendan working with me, also working on studies in terms of statistics and data management. If we were to talk about this picture today, it would look a little bit different in terms of the distributions of green dots. I don't think we'd say 4 in Galway anymore. We're missing a few dots here and there. But in general, I would say that if you're talking about people in Ireland with a job like mine to support clinical trials as statisticians who have some experience in that role, the number is fewer than 10. And the number might be 6. Depends, right? So less than what Aberdeen has, right? That's what we have nationally to support clinical trials. So if we are to double the number of trials, and hopefully that comes with a doubling of the number of investigator-led trials, right? We do not have enough capacity to support that right now, right? And this doesn't just include doing the trials. We have steering committees, need for blinded statisticians, who aren't directly associated with the trial, need for statisticians on data monitoring committees. There's a lot of needs out there, and those are only going to grow. So that was regulated, but what about these non-regulated trials, again, which include investigator-led trials, just things that don't need a regulator's stamp at the end of them, and clinical research more appropriately. There's a reason why regulated research dictates that we need statisticians involved. There's a reason why it's in black and white, right? Because statisticians have an important job in the overall part of running trials and making them rigorous and all the rest of it. So for clinical research more broadly, we have a real need for more statistical expertise and inputs. So very notably, very recently, the Declaration of Helsinki was recently updated. And among many really important things that have come in there around more openness and transparency, you see that this term, more focus on scientifically sound, rigorous design and execution, and this term research waste, right? The avoidance of research waste. Now, for many people, often when I talk about research waste, it's the first time they're hearing about it. And it's not a complicated idea. It just basically means that we work in clinical research. We want most of our research, to have some potential for application, to actually improve. What we do is very much an applied science. So we need to ask good questions for that to happen. We need to make sure that we're clearly communicating the results of our studies for that to happen. We need to make sure that those communications are accessible by decision makers. But also we have to make sure that the methods, everything that goes into the design, the execution, the reporting, the interpretation of the trial is done to a very high standard. And that doesn't solely rely on the perspective or expertise of a statistician, but that is certainly a very important part of doing that, right? The statistician is required, whether they are a statistician or maybe they have some other role, but someone that has that expertise in statistics and statistical thinking is how we avoid research waste. And we can now see that this framework around research waste appears in the Health Service Executive, the HSC Research Strategy for Ireland, where it's adopted from the NIHR. And again, here, quality, ensuring robust research design and analysis. right? You need statisticians to help do that job. Again, they don't do it by themselves, but their voice is a very important one in ensuring that process. All right, so today, now I've sounded the alarm. We need more statisticians. Well, I don't know if that's exactly the answer, but that's a topic of discussion for today throughout. I think we're going to have a lot of different conversations about how we can move forward, how we can improve supports. A few things to kind of throw out there, and I think a lot of this is going to get picked up on by some of our speakers today. We have this question of what an academic statistician, again, if we're talking about investigator-led studies who are supported by universities and sponsored by universities, universities being places whose societal value is about the pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge, right, without the commercial incentive necessarily. The academic statistician to do my job, a lot of parts of my job aren't that appealing for the academic statistician, right? What I do has a lot to do with process and quality, right? It's not just about my blue sky ideas and I'm not off doing research, even though I would like to be doing research. I'm a scientist too, right? They're very different jobs. Do we have enough postgraduate training in a thing called medical statistics? I feel like if you were a postgrad with numeracy in Ireland and you started to say, I'd like to do something with my skills and abilities, you're going to get drawn into financial maths, data science. There's so many other places that you might take your skills, whereas we really need those people working in clinical research. We need to find ways to attract and educate those people as well. We certainly need, in my opinion, better training for clinician investigators. The scientific objectives of any trial are really best served by these close collaborations between clinicians and statisticians. And inevitably, good clinician investigators pick up an awful lot of good statistical thinking and good skills. Just like good statisticians learn quite a lot about the clinical areas they tend to work in. Like that relationship's very important. We have questions about, what is the role of the funder? And certainly in Ireland with the HRB, they've been very proactive about ensuring that we are doing what we're supposed to be doing around data management and data stewardship. And so now I think there's going to be more kind of focus on ensuring that studies have the appropriate supports around statistics and data analysis as well. I think we have some tension between funders assuming that the universities are providing those things and universities assuming that if the funder wanted those things, they would explicitly pay for them, right? And so I think a lot of studies fall in the gaps in between by not having this expertise. I think there are questions about how we fund the kind of work we do. It kind of goes back to this distinction between an applied statistician, maybe an academic statistician. How are we supposed to have sustainable funding for infrastructure? So our CRF, for example, we are not a research center. We are not, we are here to support PIs and clinician investigators. We are not here to be those people, right? We're not here to lead the studies and come up with the ideas. We're here to help people execute them. And so the funding for that has to be different in some way. And then a final point is we have to, think more about how we coordinate the resources we do have. And I do worry a little bit in Ireland that, being a small country, I think there can be sometimes pulls to centralize things. But this is the kind of work that I feel very strongly has to be locally supported because it is about relationships with people. It is about working directly with investigators. This is not stuff that we can do from a Zoom from Dublin or somewhere else. Just a few more points, I'll shut up. A few big picture challenges, I think, to acknowledge is, we had Doug Altman writing in 1994 that we produce too much research. And producing too much research means that the quality of that research must suffer. Yeah. That's 1994. I think we all know, those of us working in science and academic medicine, that problem has only gotten worse, right? We are producing so much research, a 50% increase, not improvement, a 50% increase in the number of publications just over the past 6 years, right? But no investment, no additional investment underpinning that, right? We haven't gotten better and more efficient at this. We're just doing it more. So you can do the math there. When I think about statistics and clinical research, I think about this set of quotes all the time. I think we all are feeling the impacts of number one, people getting rich lying to people who want to be lied to, and we are trying to resist that urge, I'm sure. I think of where I'd like to be. I just want to be number two. I just want to tell the truth, my form of the truth, to people who want to know the truth, and make my good living, and do some useful stuff, and I'd be a happy camper. I do worry that too often we're in the lower, we're in this third one here, trying to bring truth, again, for lack of a better word, to people that don't always want to hear it, right? We always want all of our research to be phenomenally important and impactful and all the rest of it, but that's an impossibility. So I think about this quite a bit. And then finally, if we're going to get over these hurdles, there are so many knock-on effects to a greater investment in statistics and statistical expertise. We hear all the time about how trials are too expensive. Trials are too expensive, they're too expensive, they're too expensive. So maybe we can do an electronic health record and we'll shove it through an algorithm, and on the other side of that there will be insights that we can use. Surely that's going to be cheaper than doing trials. But there's other ways to do trials cheaper, which is to design them more appropriately and more efficiently. Right? We leave a lot of meat on the bone when we don't have expert statisticians involved, particularly at the design stage of studies. Right? So that's the easy win to make trials more efficient. We hear all the time, people point to novel, more efficient designs, adaptive studies, platform studies, baskets, umbrellas. All of those kind of things are wonderful to hear about, but to actually put them into practice involves an awful lot of different types of expertise, including statistical expertise. We would hope to create better consumers of health research, whether those are clinicians or other policy or decision makers. We'd hope that more investment in statistics would be a counter to what I think is an awful lot of hype in academic medicine. Everything works, everything's phenomenal, every university press release ever written by a clinical study sponsored by a university is just going to be changing the world. It's not realistic, and that doesn't help us when that's the kind of situation we're in. And obviously similar benefits, not just for CTEMPs and devices, studies of medicines, but also medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. So, I don't think anybody fell asleep. I've been keeping a pretty good eye on things, but just if you're waking up, the TLDR here, if I was to convey anything, it's this. Trials can be good, but something I think not enough people understand is bad trials harm. They provide noise pollution at the very least, making it hard to find things that work, and can give you wrong answers. Good trials need good statisticians.